So thanks very much for that introduction. What I'd like to do in this time now is to basically go over the context and motivations and outline data in terms of my Bible project. Does not work in such so I'm going to be giving some context and motivation of the paper and briefly trying to outline the main argument that I'm making. But hopefully you should all have access to the whole paper, so if you can start with interest a little bit more in there, and I'll be able to cover in this time. So the paper forms part of the first chapter of my course. And the main interest in this is to look at the role of citizens in facing justice. So it struck me that many citizens of liberal Western democracies appear to be very far removed from the African states. So we have powerful state actors making significant decisions that instigate or perpetuate global injustice, and no one seems to be responsible for these actions. In some cases, it's clearly individuals with devices or even their interpretation, particularly in light of the democratic claims of these states and their citizens. I argue that in order to ensure we don't make our states into responsibility laundering machines, to use Annie Stills' term, citizens should be viewed as collectively morally responsible for the acts of their states, because of their buy-in to democracy, the way they benefit from and influence state action, and their unique position therein to hold their states accountable in these liberal Western states that I'm looking at. The upshot of this responsibility is an individual duty to do your bit in order to fulfill this collective duty. This might be to contribute to reparations for past injustice, to ensure that you vote for a party with a just foreign policy, or to campaign against a particular policy that you deem unjust. These sorts of arguments form the greater part of my project, but in order to start making these claims, I needed to have a clear view on what kind of state actions we ought to be encouraging or discouraging, what constitutes an unjust act in terms of states. In one sense, this is particularly straightforward on my view. There are at least two duties which I've argued elsewhere are almost universally agreed upon among theorists and practitioners: a duty of non-harm towards others, and a duty to provide the very basic human necessities. Even a theorist like David Miller, for example, who has a fairly clear nationalist view, and so is committed to the state being a special site of justice, would support these kinds of principles of global justice. Currently, we see widespread failure on the part of states to fulfill even these basic duties, providing plenty of motivation for my project of analyzing the political channels of responsibility between citizens and their democratic states. My focus on citizens, however, led me to consider another level of state duties. Citizens, on the whole, seem to clearly ascribe to a relational view of justice. While in theory, some might admit to justice owed to all individuals equally, strong immigration policies, welfare systems, and a strong bias in favor of local charities all suggest that, in practice, citizens seem to consider those closer to them to have stronger claims of justice on them. Given my aim of encouraging citizens to work harder to ensure global justice through the political channels that are available to them, I began to consider whether the implications of this kind of relational view might be broader than the average citizen considers, and so a useful motivation for action in questions of global justice. Combining these thoughts with a more philosophical interest in the concept of reciprocity and what work this can do for us in relational views, I developed the view that I'm going to be presenting today. So the argument has two parts. Firstly, I argue that those who advocate a relational view often use terms such as reciprocity or cooperation as key elements in grounding special duties of justice, but do not give fair recognition to the work that underlying principles of justice and the nature and aims of the practice do in terms of informing what kinds of duties of distributive justice result. Secondly, I argue that in light of this perspective, we can see that relations between citizens and relations between states as agents, although often very different, do share similar underlying principles and aims, and so it's incongruent that such different kinds of distributive duties result. Given the limited time we have, I'm going to mainly focus on the second part of this argument, as hopefully it relates a bit more closely to the work that many of you are interested in. But just to say briefly what what the first argument is generally about, without arguing for it. The idea is that we often see people talking about reciprocity as what is the special factor that creates certain duties of justice. But when we look a bit closely, we see that reciprocity exists in many different forums. We see reciprocity perhaps in the workplace and reciprocity between citizens within the state. Yet we get different kinds of distributive duties coming out. We have on one hand a more merit-based system, and on the other hand a more broadly egalitarian system. So when I looked more closely into this, I began to argue that what seems to really be doing the work is a commitment to some kind of underlying principle of justice. So this might be, for example, in the case of citizens, a commitment to the idea that citizens are owed mutual respect, for example. On the other hand, we also have the nature and the aims of the specific practice. So if you look, for example, at a tennis club, you might have two tennis clubs, both of which are governed by some sort of norms of reciprocity. One is trying to win the league, and one's trying to just be a good social forum for pensioners. They're going to end up with different kinds of norms and different kinds of duties that they owe to each other, although both are based on a system of reciprocity. So what's doing the work in that case is something about the aims of the practice and the nature of which it's trying to be governed. So I argue that if we're going to take this relational view of citizens seriously, we need to look a bit more closely at these underlying factors. So when we look at the case of citizens, which I'm going to do now, we can see certain underlying principles and nature and aims. And when we take that and look at the international case, it begins to look a bit more similar than when we just look at the surface level of interactions between the two. So that's the second part of the argument that I'm going to be moving on to now. Just very briefly before I do so, just a word about the kinds of relations I'm going to be talking about. Some kind of long-term interaction, an element of mutual dependence. So we're not talking about something like long-term exploitation or just once-off interactions. Right, so onto the domestic case. What are we seeing when we look at the practice of citizenship? I will not elaborate in detail the nature of these relations or duties, but will point to three main ways in which the nature and aims of the practice are distinct, in order to, in the next section, analyze these interactions between states in more detail. Firstly, in a democratic state, all members have an equal political status. While in many cases there will be disparities in wealth and power, there are important ways in which citizens are considered to be equals, and so equals in this cooperative venture. There is a mutual recognition of each other's equality, at a minimum on a political level. In a democratic state, all citizens are given an equal vote and are subject to the same legal system. And while some may be wealthier or more powerful, in the relevant domain of citizenship, there is no official hierarchy, as we might see in the workplace, where more or less senior positions are linked to different roles and remuneration. While they are political leaders, these are considered representatives of the people rather than some kind of boss. Secondly, the goods that are produced by this particular cooperative venture are of particular importance: security, stability, health, and so on. It seems intuitive that where we raise the stakes of the cooperation, the duties we owe to our fellow cooperators may increase. Thirdly, the cooperation within a state is particularly formalized. There are clear expectations and norms for the functioning of the state apparatus, which makes for clearer insight into the kinds of duties we may have to each other within the state. Just like, for example, a dating couple might be on slightly unclear or shifting ground when it comes to the duties that they have to each other, it becomes much clearer the more formalized the version of relationship they have, moving from dating to in a relationship to getting married or entering a civil union. The formalization of a relationship cements expectations and increases dependence, which in turn increases the ways in which we have duties to ensure the correct functioning of this relationship. These factors about the nature and aims of the practice of the state are relevant in considering what our relational duties might be. It is not just that there is reciprocity or a cooperative practice. It is the equal status, the very valuable goods and aims, and the highly formalized relationships that evoke the particular set of complex and strong duties of distributive justice within the state. With these key features in mind, we can turn to the case of relations between states as agents. The initial question faced here is whether states are involved in long-term mutually dependent relationships, like the practices I described earlier. It seems clear that it is not the case that states exist completely independently or without stable contracts. The EU, NATO, and NAFTA are clear examples of close interaction and mutual dependence. In addition, the regulation of international waters and flight paths both require intensive cooperation, to the extent that they could not function without majority participation. It seems plausible that if we consider certain features of a cooperative practice to evoke duties of distributive justice within the state, weaker forms of these features may evoke weaker duties of distributive justice in another context, yet of the same kind. In what follows, I will look more closely at states' interaction in light of some of the key features highlighted in the case of citizens: the principle of equal status, valuable ends, and formalized relations. So the principle of equal status. Just like citizens may differ in their power and influence in certain sectors, but all have one equal vote, so too do states have disparities in power, but are considered equals in many other ways. The sovereignty of each nation is an equal right for all recognized states. States are also equal members of many international organizations and equals before international law, which is clearly less immediate and binding than domestic law, yet an important factor in international relations nevertheless. Secondly, we have the value of the good pursued. I think there are at least two clear goals of contemporary global interaction, particularly from the perspective of Western liberal democracies, and these would be peace and trade. Both of these goods seem imperative to the functioning of our modern societies. Cooperation on issues of security is vital in order to track and prevent security threats that are increasingly transnational. In addition, constant negotiations and cooperation have helped to reduce the instances of wars between states themselves. States also cooperate with each other through trade with a number of trade agreements to facilitate this interaction, as well as shared rules of regulation to govern the trade, and a strong international financial regulation. This trade is vital, particularly in areas such as healthcare and agriculture, where technological advances can be shared and improved through collaboration. Thirdly, we have the formalized nature of the relationship. The regulations of institutions like the WTO, as well as numerous bilateral and multi-trade agreements, are also a good indication of the ways in which a lot of state interaction is through formalized channels. A clear knowledge of what is expected of each party and how the interaction is carried out and regulated creates a deeper dependency as agents become reliant on this cooperation. So in light of this analysis, I argue that it's apparent, at least in some respect, that international relations share features of the relations of citizens, and so may be subject to a similar kind of duties of justice. That is, while we often characterize relations between states to be governed by principles of merit or desert, perhaps more broadly egalitarian duties are owed. Instead of just considering duties of non-harm to exist between two states, we might think, for example, that two states who interact extensively would also owe each other support should an important crop fail, or the resources to participate equally in a certain trade negotiation, or perhaps fair rather than just mutually advantageous terms of interaction. Most states willingly and often voluntarily participate in a number of long-term, mutually dependent relations. These relations are often based on an equal status with valuable aims and formalized structures. It is clear that citizens and states as agents do not function in entirely similar ways, nor are they subject to entirely similar regulations or laws. We can also see that each state will differ from another in the kinds of interactions it has and the organizations of which it's a member. There's therefore, in this view, no one overarching global system with a single authority to which we could apply the label of cooperating in X manner and so bound by Y principle of distributive justice. We are not talking about one overarching practice of state interaction. Instead, state interaction can be viewed in different dimensions and instances on different series of practices. In some cases, states are clearly acting out of pure self-interest and not cooperating. In others, they are involved in formalized interactions with a shared valuable aim, long-term sustainability, and mutual dependence. In the former, issues of justice would appeal to non-relational grounds, and in the latter, we can in addition appeal to relational grounds. Importantly, not all state action will easily fall into one or the other extreme. And indeed, motivations of states may often be empirically disputed, given the covert nature of many elements of state decision-making. Applying the tools of relational duties will not therefore provide a clear list of duties owed between each state, but rather a map to navigate the complicated terrain. Relational duties between states will provide the resources to draw upon in order to articulate another layer of duties in contemporary international relations that often seem intuitively present, but do not always fit into the non-relational global justice paradigm. Just in summary, before I finish off, what I've argued today is that when we look at citizens, we tend to see them subscribing to a relational view of justice. And if we begin to look more carefully at the relational view, I've argued that it's important for us to look at the underlying principles and the different nature and aims of the practices. And once we have this kind of view of a relational view of justice, we can begin to compare the domestic and international case and see that they're often similar, if weaker, instances of the same nature and aims and underlying principles. I argue that this is enough to suggest we should be considering, at least in many cases, broadly egalitarian distributive duties of justice rather than just merit and desert in state interaction. So in addition to basic and vital duties of non-harm and providing basic human necessities, extensive interaction should strengthen the duties between states rather than just being a game of each state trying to gain over the other states involved. Thanks very much.
In this paper, I want to argue for an alternative paradigm that can emerge out of a certain way of thinking about alternative institutional arrangements for sharing of the global resources between the rich nations of the developed world and the so-called poor and not so developed nations of the developing world. So it's a kind of a transactional moral analysis, the framework that I would like to employ here. And what I aim to do is that through this transactional moral analysis, I want to explore whether one can develop a reflexive, responsive model of alternative to the kind of existing international relationship of contract where bilateral, trilateral or multilateral contractual agreements result into winning of the one side and major losses for the other side. How do we alter this outcome that has happened since 90s till 2013-14, where developing nations have remained as a major loser in all kinds of multinational, multilateral trade agreements and other kinds of agreements. Now, the cue that I get from POGE is this idea of global resource dividend. Now, global resource dividend for me, if we translate it in moral terms, is actually a moral dividend. The moral dividend that can arise out of a willingness to share, to give away voluntarily a certain part of one's resources which is to one's advantage in running the economy and the distribution in a national context. This would practically mean that developed nations such as America or Germany are ready to give away a large part of their natural resources and the gains that they accrue by utilization of those natural resources to countries which are abysmally poor and which are suffering from abject poverty. As it is well known by the global statistics, large part of the southern countries are having a huge mass of globally poor people who are not only endangered in terms of their lives, amenities, entitlements and rights, but who are going towards a slow death because of hunger, because of lack of medicine, because of lack of access to the other life-saving facilities. So this situation of a slow hunger-related death and the trauma that is attached in the everyday experience of these people throughout the not so developed countries of the South is a major concern, and this concern can be addressed by a complete moral selflessness on the part of the developed countries in willing to part away with the resources that they are generating as a dividend by utilization of their natural resources. So this form of exchange is a kind of a moral exchange, and it is going to create a kind of a moral entitlement for the not so developed nations from the share of the resource dividends which are created in the developed countries. Now this model, or this what today stands as an implication of the GRD argument which was proposed by Tom Pogge, is still not actualized. And something that is not actualized, how that can be actualized is a problem before us. Now, to tackle this problem, one has to give a complicated moral argument. And I want to give three complicated moral arguments here in order to correct this situation, because Tom Pogge proposes a corrective mechanism by utilizing the principle of difference. Now, principle of difference in moral terms would specifically mean one who is in a morally advantageous position, one who has a commitment to certain moral norms and values in order to share, in order to redistribute, has to take this duty or responsibility of giving up. So they have to have a moral obligation as part of their responsibility, and if they are failing in their moral responsibility, they have to be held responsible. Not just accountable, but they have to be held morally responsible. Now this idea of moral responsibility is something which is a very tall order, which doesn't exist in the UN covenants, in the human rights treaties, and in other international legal instruments. So one can see here that moral demand on international legal instruments is higher than what the international legal instruments are actually trying to say. So therefore, there is an aporia here between the moral demand and the international legal instruments, because legal instruments never allow fixing of the moral responsibility in case of moral failure. So one has to really rethink about certain legal instruments at the international level, which I would say won't be globally binding, but which would be normatively acceptable as a kind of a consensually agreed upon moral framework in negotiating this distribution of resource dividends from the developed to the developing world. So this is the first argument. The second important argument is that once again the question of moral contract would come back here. Whether the contracting parties themselves would agree on a common ground for sharing. In most cases, whenever there is this bilateral contractual agreement, there is a common ground, but this common ground is based on the laws of economic exchange, whereby dividends go to the one side. Even if dividends are shared, the larger dividends and larger profits that accrue out of this sharing of the dividends go to one side, and it doesn't benefit both the sides equally. So there is an inequity and there is an inbuilt disparity in this kind of an international legal contract in sharing economic resources. So this economistic paradigm now needs to be converted and transformed into a moral paradigm. How does one do so? One clue, of course, is that if powerful countries, G20 and certain other blocks of countries agree between themselves that they are going to play a greater responsible role, then it is possible to change this economistic contractual situation into a situation of moral contract. But that is still to happen in the international global order. So that is still awaiting us. And the third important issue that I want to bring in is the question of pursuance of certain a set of moral values. When I say a set of moral values, one would be taking an evaluative stand. And an evaluative stand that follows from sense argument about transpositional understanding of justice, which is not just based on position relative understanding of agency and the local context, but in terms of evolving multiple criterion of justice in a plural global context, which can incorporate a variety of moral claims and right claims as well. So one has to have a sufficiently broad, open, multiple and parallel criterion of global justice in order to enact a sense of justice which can incorporate specific demands and claims of justice on the part of smaller nations, and especially on the part of developing nations. Now, how that kind of pluralism can be entertained within the existing global framework of justice is a major question. Now, in order to introduce a kind of parallelism, a kind of pluralism, a kind of multiplicity, what one needs to do is to take a bottom-up approach. One has to take into account the claims of justice which is put forth by various alienated communities, by marginalized social groups who are living at the margins of the world order, who are arising from deserts, who are arising from displaced communities, and who are also not part of a democratic order, maybe part of a tyrannical dictatorial order. The claims of justice that are arising from such communities whose rights are visibly violated, those claims are to be incorporated into a larger international global framework that would like to evolve a transpositional, plural and multiple criteria of justice. If we can evolve ourselves into that level of understanding each other's pain and suffering in terms of accommodating the claims of rights and the claims of justice that are arising from the bottom, to which most of us are falling silent, or to which most of us are keeping ourselves conveniently deaf, and we are not listening to these voices. So we have to create a situation whereby these voices can be listened to at the international level. So who are going to listen to these voices? Is it the elites of the powerful, rich, developed countries, or is it a set of conscience keepers who will like to morally rearm themselves in order to listen to these voices of the extremely marginalized and who have not found a place in the international global order, in order to carry their voices and construct appropriate normative criterion of justice. And this needs to be worked out at the ground level by taking into account the multiplicity, the diversity, the differences, and the tremendous amount of even incommensurability that is arising between claims of justice, let's say, from an Asian country and from a sub-Saharan African country. So all this cannot be scaled up in terms of millennial developmental goals of removing hunger or removing diseases, but rather these are to be specific action driven towards addressing certain problems and bringing in immediate solutions, and the experience of which will lead us to understand in a better way what could be that multi-layered, multiple criteria of justice that we can create in a bottom-up manner. So if these three complicated ways of looking at the current, I would say, aporia between the moral framework and the legal framework is taken into account, then it is possible to reconceptualize the whole idea of global justice. Now, one way of reconceptualizing this would be to seek really that there is a larger deliberative global politics in the arena of justice, and this deliberative global politics has to become sovereignty free. The idea of national sovereignty in order to protect rights of certain nationals and citizens probably have to be given up. Although this may sound a very tall claim, but unless sovereignty is redistributed itself as a kind of a public good and not just as a kind of a political good, if sovereignty is reconceptualized in terms of a kind of communitarian sovereignty and going down below further in terms of groups who are making claims of right, if sovereignty can be relocated in the groups who are making claims of right, it's possible to have a global redistribution of sovereignty instead of having national sovereignty. So this is one way of keeping the nation states in their place and at the same time reorient these nation states to a new notion of sovereignty, a kind of a people community-based sovereignty. And if we can agree on the terms of a people community-based sovereignty, it's possible to make way forward for redistribution of global resource dividends as well. So this is one way. The second important way is that we have to be conscious and sensitive about violators' normative claims. The violators who are taking away resources and accumulating them in their own hands, they also make certain normative claims. The normative claims in terms of which violation is possible comes through multilateral trade agreement, comes through WTO, comes through TRIPS, comes through many other such international legal instruments. Such legal instruments never take into account the way the rights of other people are violated. So how do you incorporate a broader human rights framework in the multilateral trade agreement? That becomes the moot question. And in order to pursue a human rights agenda in the multilateral trade agreement framework, one has to once again look at local knowledges, the kind of indigenous knowledge pool that is available in the entire global south. And this pool of knowledge is simply bypassed It is bypassed by law, it is bypassed by science and engineering, bypassed by IPR, bypassed by biotechnology, and in a variety of ways of a resource extractive mechanism. So the resource extractive mechanism has to be now constrained and limited to recognize this indigenous pool of knowledge. And if this indigenous pool of knowledge can be recognized, then there could be a larger politics of recognition, as well as there could be a larger framework of deliberative politics of recognition. And once one takes that kind of an understanding of understanding from the bottom the indigenous claims of rights and indigenous pool of knowledge, then it is possible to incorporate a human rights agenda within the multilateral trade agreements and the framework which currently exists. Now, whether this kind of a framework will be acceptable or not is a major question. But in order to make it acceptable, we must have international global pressure groups working on these multilateral trade bodies, and they have to persuade the powerful actors in order to agree to come to terms to understand how they violate. And the instances of violation have to take primacy over instances of settling certain agreed upon contracts and certain give and take norms. So norms have to be slightly tilted towards understanding who violates and fixing the responsibility of violating the rights of others. If multilateral trade agreements can be democratized in terms of a deliberative politics, in terms of recognizing the separate indigenous pools of knowledge and their claims of right, then it is possible to widen, democratize the multilateral forums as well. So that is another way. And the last thing that I want to propose here is understanding how one can have a feasible alternative at this point of time, because this is a time of transition. Probably we are moving away from multilateral trade relations or multilateral trade agreement to once again recognizing the specific trading and economic potential of a variety of actors who are nation states or also groups within the nation states. Now, in order to recognize the potential of each of the group and each of the nation state, once again, one has to probably develop a transitory mechanism. How this transitory mechanism shall be worked out is a very, very important question. In the last UPR, Universal Periodic Review, that happened in UN General Council on Human Rights, it is argued that each of the nation state must be given a right to set their own economic agenda, within which they will incorporate variety of global agenda, which apparently on paper is happening. But what is not happening on paper even is that the right claims of peoples of this nation is never recognized as a right claim. Rather, this is incorporated as a kind of an agenda, as if one has to perform certain things, one has to give certain rights, but it should be slightly changed and molded to accepting right claims as right claims in order to give them a fair and a clearer representation within the agenda that is set by each of the nation states. Now, in the UPR negotiations, this hasn't happened. Many of the nations didn't agree to remove trade barriers which are existing for the poor farmers, of the poor producers, of even the small manufacturers. That is one area where UPR could not really contribute in the fourth round. Maybe in the fifth round UPR can contribute to this. And in parallel to this, in the WTO negotiations once again, mostly nations from the south tried to raise their specific claim and their specific expertise in certain areas of agricultural and manufacturing production. Now, these claims have been overridden by the powerful countries, because powerful countries could see that if these claims are accepted, then their own business interest is going to be marred in the developed world. Therefore, there is still an asymmetry, and there is a kind of a monopoly of opinion in the WTO agreements. And similar is the case of the climate change negotiations as well, where responsibility could not be fixed, and the claim of responsibility that developing nations are putting forth, that is not becoming acceptable to the developed nations. So there is a kind of a division in the larger global community. Now, at the end of all these very, very conflicting and very, very persisting kind of arguments that are coming from the developed world, one can see certain major players are remaining on the other side. G20, even G8 people, they are standing on the other side and they're resisting these claims that are coming from the developing countries. So therefore, I don't know how this complicated international situation can be corrected. it's morally good and fine to talk about a moral dividend and a moral resource dividend. If we can reinstitute a sense of morality in this hardcore ways in which political negotiations and trade negotiations happen at the international level, then probably we can think of a different international moral order where redistribution of resources is possible, and at the same time a moral right to equality can be re-established in a variety of international and global fora. This is what arises from Poge's very interesting insight about this global resource dividend. It should be transformed into moral resource dividend by transforming the actors themselves. This is all that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.